everyone. My name's Robin Ewing, and it's my privilege and pleasure on behalf of the Foundation for Learning and Literacy and my co-convener, Jo Padgham, to introduce you all to our Literature Symposium, a series of 12 online sessions that celebrate the joy, the wonder, and the transformative power of rich literature in our lives and in our learning. In this session, we're going to hear from Dr. Bronwyn Bancroft, Joanne Rossbridge, and Kelly Booker. I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Darug country, and I also want to celebrate the role that story and all of the arts play at the centre of our First Nations cultures. Over the series, you're going to hear from authors, artists, academics, consultants, parents, community members, and you're going to have the opportunity to hear a whole lot of different viewpoints and understandings. But the 12 organisations involved all agree that rich literature should be central to all of us. We're very privileged now to be able to introduce Dr. Bronwyn Bancroft, artist, illustrator, author, scholar, activist. And we're going to talk to her for a few minutes about what she sees is really important for Australian children and young people. Bronwyn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. I'd just like to acknowledge the Awakwa land that I currently have my studio on. I moved from Sydney several years ago, about 5 years ago, and I've come back to country with my two daughters. So it's been quite revelatory to be home, except of course we're just experiencing flood devastation in our area at the moment, which is quite horrifying. But you know, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. Bronwyn, you've done so much with your work to help Australian children, young people, all Australians really, connect to country and understand the importance of First Nations culture for all of us. Would you like to share a little bit about your work and why it's been, you know, a struggle in many ways, but so important nevertheless?
Yeah, sure. I grew up in a small country town called Tenterfield, and last year my father would have been 100 on the 9th of December. And when I grew up, there was a small public, we had a school library, and there were absolutely no books about Aboriginal Australia. Which is, you know, part of that phrase is, if I can't see me, I can't be me. It not only goes towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but it is about women, it is about people with disabilities. So when we frame our societal recognition around healthy Anglo people doing great things, and we don't recognise all the different elements that make up this rich tapestry that is now called Australian society, we are the worst for it. You know, we are not the, you know, cohesive and wonderfully rich society that we should be and be aspirational for. So when I was lucky enough to be invited to do, my first book was by Diana Kidd, who was a Jewish woman.
Yeah.
The Fat and Juicy Place, who I really adored meeting. And it was just a couple of little black and white photographs, drawings of Birdman, and my memory still serves me well, and the front cover. That was the beginning of my campaign, an individual campaign to fill the gap that I saw that existed by not recognising the oral history stories that could be turned into writing and images for the wider community of children ostensibly. But, you know, parents read to children, if the children are lucky. And therefore you're educating two very important elements of the society. I think we are richer for the amount of like books that are now coming to us. And I've noticed that in the last couple of years that there's particularly Mugabala Books are doing an excellent job of bringing forward young, emerging and divergent voices. And I think we are richer for it. But I will say that I get a lot of teachers coming to me for teachers' notes, coming to me for support to get permission to see if they can use my illustrations and my words to help prompting the children in their English classes or art classes. And I feel that all departments of education should be far more rigorous and forensic about the way that they're delivering different voices to our children so that they have a greater sense of diversity and tolerance.
Yeah.
And we don't have that at this point. Now, this is 30 years for me of doing this, and it's a struggle and frustration to see bureaucrats demand that artists, illustrators, and writers give up their work for nothing to support the education system while they have a job. So I think there's a lot of inadequate measures around this, and we as a force of teachers, educators, illustrators, writers, creators, we need to push these government departments to make them realise that everybody needs to be, in a way, treasured for actually even taking the time out to deliver these very important literary moments.
I couldn't agree more that is so important, and that we all need to really understand and are the richer for it, the diversity of who we are and how we have come together to make up, as you say, what's now called Australia. And now it's my privilege to introduce the amazing Joanne Rossbridge. Like me, Jo began her career as a primary teacher, but over the years, she's particularly specialised in working with EALD learners. She's worked in schools, in universities, and independently as a literacy consultant. Jo's particularly worked with teachers on their professional learning. And in addition, every week she gives us a wonderful website full of resources that are instructive for every teacher. And in those weekly sessions, she particularly focuses on the importance and the power of children's literature. Thank you, Jo.
Thank you, Robin. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm coming from Darug country, and in particular the history and stories of Aboriginal people across thousands of years. I think we all love a good story, whether it be oral, passed down across generations, or perhaps a new or even treasured book. A good story is just like an umbrella, provides a canopy or a shelter, and it's a place to escape the elements. So important in the life of a child as they move between home and school. Now, sometimes the umbrella, it takes us on a journey. Think about P.L. Travers with Mary Poppins and Mary Poppins leaving Cherry Tree Lane. Or if you can think of Pamela Allen's Mr. McGee, where Mr. McGee goes to sea with his brolly in hand. Just like great literature, the umbrella is timeless. It can't be replaced. And it is something that signals a transformation. For a young child, it provides a transformation from their own experience to broader worlds. I'm sure you can instantly think of your own favourite books from your own childhood that took you to somewhere new, introduced you to new and different characters, different places, times, new experiences would have been provided to you. Or perhaps that special book just gave you new confidence and a new feeling about being a reader. Now, sometimes stories are joyful, playful, but they can be puzzling. They can even be confronting and challenging. And that's all part of being taken to these new worlds as we engage with literature from the beginnings of childhood and beyond. So literature is like the umbrella for transforming the life of a young reader, opening up their world, opening up opportunities for pleasure. How we view books and reading, and I guess umbrellas for that matter, has real life implications in terms of the messages that we give to young children, both at home and also when they start school and as they move through school. Let's take a look at this child who's reading. This is Sam. He's reading at home and he's in the first year, so the beginning of his first year of school. He's made his own choice to read, and I should say share, Piranhas Don't Eat Bananas by Aaron Blabey. So have a quick look at what he's doing, and he's doing so much when you look really closely, and think about what reading is to him, and particularly at this stage of his life as he enters school.
Bananas. Piranhas Don't Eat Bananas by Aaron Blabey. Hey there, guys. Would you like a banana? What's wrong with you, Brian? You're a piranha. Well, how about some silver beet? Are you serious, Brian? We eat fish. Well, would you rather a bowl of beans? Stop it, Brian. We eat knees. Well, I bet you'd like some juicy plums. That's it, Brian! We eat bums! We don't eat apples, we don't eat beans, don't eat veggies, don't eat greens, we don't eat melons, we don't eat bananas, and the rest of them away! We are piranhas!
Careful with your voice. Careful with your voice.
Well, I think that's silly, guys. Fruit is the best. We can't take much more of this. Give it a rest. Okay, I stopped then. You'll hear no more chatter, but only if you try my awesome fruit platter. Give it here then. Munch, 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 crunch. Munch, 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 crunch. So, what do you think, guys? Is it lucky or yum? It's very nice, Brian, but we still prefer bomb! Let's do the blurb.
Do you want to read the blurb?
Yeah.
Okay, go.
Brian loves piranhas. Trouble is, Brian's a piranha, and his friends aren't happy. Not about his fruitness of it.
His fondness.
They're not happy at all.
Jo, Sam just blows me away. Can you tell me a little bit more about him, please?
He's amazing, isn't he? He's just started his first year of school this year. Yeah. He comes from a family where he's been read to throughout his whole life, particularly by his grandparents. His grandfather has spent a lot of time reading. He has gone to school excited about reading, lots of books in the house. I give him books for Christmas, as do other people, all sorts of things. So you can tell a little bit about his background. And he's super keen right now to begin reading and reading independently. And I think when he did that video, he made some comment about him being a reading teacher.
Yes.
So you can see particularly the thing I love about it is how he shares the book. It's not just him sitting reading it. He's actually sharing it with others.
Yes. And you can tell that he gets the nuances of all of it through the expression that he uses. You know, he's interpreting what's happening. He understands the humour in it all.
Yes. And he's really into books like that at the moment. So humorous books at that age. And I mean, you can see how he responds to the changing font, the punctuation, the images. He's obviously read it many times. It's a familiar text, but he's so entertaining. He's a storyteller.
He is a storyteller, and he obviously enjoys that interaction both with the author, but also with the person he's sharing the story with.
Absolutely.
Demonstrates for me all of those things that children who've had that opportunity to engage in rich story can immediately bring to their learning. You know, he's able to interpret what's happening. He's so much more likely to be able to identify with people with other perspectives. You know, he's got that ability to experience empathy, and he has obviously learned a lot about piranhas, etc., in the process.
Yes, no, he has. He's got that joy, and I just hope we can sustain that. You know, in his next couple of terms at school, next few years, his life, that he can continue to enjoy reading and expand his reading as he grows older.
And you know, I think sometimes there's so much emphasis, because we're all so concerned about all children becoming literate and deeply literate, that sometimes that wonderful joy and pleasure in reading can be lost, because that's perhaps that underlying anxiety that there might be an issue or a problem. And I think that's something that we need to keep foremost, how wonderful it is to just get lost in a great story.
Yes.
I think that sort of is a great beginning for all children, and it makes me hope that we can find ways for all children to have those opportunities, because for me, that's one of the big problems in Australia at the moment. We've got 1 in 6 children in poverty. We know that not all children are going to come to school with that kind of orientation to what reading is, what story is, to what it means to be literate.
Let's take a closer look at Sam. As just mentioned, he loves his books and demonstrates many skills and understandings when reading. He knows how to hold and interact with a book, to not only share with others, but to bring joy to himself also as a storyteller. He knows the role of the front and the back cover, reading the title and the author and so on, and then he turns it over and at the end of the reading looks at the blurb as well and uses the term the blurb. He clearly understands directionality and concepts of print, and he uses his understanding of the role of punctuation and the font changes throughout the book as he adjusts his expression, pitch, intonation. Again, not just to entertain us as we are read to, but he also develops or shows quite clearly his knowledge of the text, his knowledge of how the characters develop and his appreciation of them, as well as how his voice is actually revealing or kind of structuring the story as a narrative and as a whole. Obviously, this is a familiar favourite. Okay, it's been read many times before, and he knows much of it quite off by heart. But he's still paying close attention to print in several places, particularly where the language patterns change and where the text becomes less familiar, more so towards the end of the book. He's aware of the relationship between letters and sounds, as well as rhyme throughout. And he's bringing his semantic knowledge and making connections between words and pictures as he goes through and entertains us. He's also practicing his own fluency, and he's monitoring himself. He's monitoring his own reading as he goes along. He returns to the text several times to check for accuracy, even though he is drawing on those past readings of the book. I don't know if you noticed when he read the word or and then he checked and changed it to well, which was in the text. So he's very much relying on his earlier readings, but he has the understanding of monitoring as he goes along. When he gets to the blurb after the end of his story, he gives us another insight into his abilities as a reader, and he's becoming more focused on the written text there, needs some guidance with the word fondness. However, he's still focusing on meaning, isn't he? All that way, bringing all his resources to text. He's drawing on everything he's got, and that's what's making him a successful reader. He's reading for pleasure in order to read to learn and grow with picture books. His picture books are his umbrella for engaging with new ideas and experiences. I think I mentioned just earlier that humor at this stage for him really resonates, and that's guiding a lot of the choice of books he's reading as well. So he's experimenting with humor, often happens at this age, through text. And then what he's finding and negotiating through text is also bringing to his broader world as he interacts with others in his family and beyond his family as well, in everyday interactions. Put simply, Sam is a storyteller, isn't he? And isn't that what we'd love for all kids? Surely this is what reading is about. And the books we provide children should reflect this rather than be vehicles for teaching isolated skills, which can often be devoid of meaning. As students move through school, it's critical that we both sustain and develop their love of reading, whilst also developing their language and literacy skills. Sam clearly exemplifies this as he begins school. Fortunately, we're really lucky. Australia has many amazing children's books, be it picture books or novels, even digital books and so on. We've got a lot that we can draw upon. Quality literature not only has its place in reading, but also in encouraging and modelling writing to engage with the experiences, the views, the worlds of others, and for students to make connections with their own world and identity too. So really rich literature, we often talk about in terms of reading, but it's just as critical in terms of supporting writing. And I think for teachers, it's key that we've got amazing texts in our own personal library, as well as having access to great texts in school libraries and so on. So sections from a book I'm about to share with you were actually created by a student who was a very, very reluctant reader and writer. However, with careful selection of books and conversations focusing on the choices of a variety of well-known authors and illustrators, this student engaged in writing her own text to share a holiday experience. Her particular book was called Why I Love the Top End. She'd recently visited Darwin, Kakadu, the top of the Northern Territory. And by combining both her written language with reading and writing, but also bringing in the creative arts and artwork, which was really a really important hook for her, she was using the ideas, I guess, shared by Bronwyn Bancroft from her amazing book called Why I Love Australia. So let me take you through, and you can have a closer look at some examples. So Why I Love Australia is a really rich text, linguistically, visually, culturally, and in what I'm just sharing with you here, it was actually a fantastic model for students to create their own texts and acknowledge both the author and also their own connection to place, country, and personal experiences. So the pages you can see on the left here are examples from a student book. They're beautiful double pages. And you'll notice how the language choices have really carefully been, I guess, scaffolded through engagement with Bronwyn's Why I Love Australia. It's a great model or mentor text, particularly for developing extended noun groups to build description. So you can see not only the written text has been developed as a result of reading and increasing student engagement, but also the visuals as well. I have to say that this is one of my favourite books, but it should be in every teacher's collection, their own personal collection. And it's the kind of book you would buy multiple copies of using the school's budget, so that we have these great texts that can be used in classrooms and students can actually get their hands on them too, particularly to appreciate the sensational artwork as well. Here we have another example of connecting reading and writing. Let me just read you a couple of pages from this book created by a student. It's called Ruby's First Year, and it's about her new puppy. Here we go. You'll note, November, graduated from puppy school, played outside with Lucy, slept on my back, cuddled Lucy, cuddled Lynn, slept, dreamt. Notice the verbs and where they're positioned. Learned to fly, slept, learnt to stand up. Repetition as well. December, looked cute, looked cute, looked cute. And it goes on for an entire year. But great texts were used to get to this point. So great text to read, resulting in great texts being created. This didn't happen without careful design of teaching and learning and support through deconstructing model or mentor texts and writing both joint and independent texts along the way in the process and all the talk that goes along with that. In terms of using mentor texts, maybe there's some features of some texts that you're familiar with that you recognised. If you think about Jackie French's Diary of a Wombat series, you could perhaps see some connections, and also some of the conventions that Alison Lester uses in a range of her books as well. So just very quickly, this one's Baby Wombats Week by Jackie French, and I've just got one page here, but you can see this is about a week, not a year. Well, we've got the heading at the top. Notice we've got a series of images going across the page. So a lot of talk was done about the number of events per, in this case, it's per day, but in the case of Ruby's first year, it was per month. And which were the important ones? Which ones would you make salient and so on? Notice sometimes we've got, probably not so much on this page, but throughout the book, more detail in each event. Sometimes it's just a verb, but often the written text accompanying the images begins with a verb. Okay, the subject, if you like, is ellipsed. And I think it places more emphasis on the happenings or the goings on because it's put right up the front. And if you think about it, be it a wombat or a puppy, it's really about what they do, the actions they undertake, whether they be quite active or even quite passive from time to time. By reflecting on Sam and the work of other students that's been shared, it's clear that engagement with quality literature or a good story is critical for students, both at home and at school. This will impact not only on their reading, but also their creation of texts as they move through school and engage with a greater repertoire of texts, broader topics, and a range of different genres. This will expand their reading and their writing. How do we ensure this love of reading is fostered or developed as children start school? There are many questions. How do we ensure all students have experiences like Sam is a good one to start with. What do we do for those who haven't had access to a range of books prior to starting school, who haven't been read to? Do we provide every child in the first year of schooling with their own little package of books that they get to take home and keep? They become part of their own personal library. I know of some schools who've done this. What about giving a book instead of a lolly when we get vaccinated in the early years. Maybe we could have a book and a lolly though. We have had policy where parents who bring their newborn home from hospital in their little pack for their new baby have been given books for their child. In fact, I actually know of someone who received 2 hard copies of Bronwyn Bancroft books. So very lucky people, or in particular, a very lucky baby. So there's lots of things we could think about for helping students to be engaged in reading from the very, very early stages. What else can we do to foster that joy of reading across both home and school? For students who may not come to school with these experiences, we need to provide them at school. We need to give clear messages about what reading is and what it can and should be when students start school, day one, throughout that first year and way beyond, rather than falling into a deficit reductionist view of reading. So choice of great literature in schools is critical from the beginning and way into, well, throughout life, really, isn't it? So yes, everyone does love a good story. It's part of the human experience as we engage in and across cultures and come together through sharing literature. As adults, it's us that have that crucial responsibility to provide that umbrella for children, both at home and at school.
I just had my grandchild up here. We do make-up stories. And sometimes I wish I had a tape recorder because it's hilarious. So even growing up, my children, our constant thing would be we'd read books. Of course, we'd read books because the idea that there are children in this country that do not have access to rich resources to be able to expand and navigate the imaginative world, which informs the real world. Yeah. And this is a very important component in the early learning. I'm you know, with my children, they're all extraordinary, free thinkers, very creative, very independent in their thought processes. And that has come from a lifetime of rigor. You know, I think all of them, they've all got degrees. And my father was not allowed to have access to school in this country.
Yes.
So that's 100 years ago last year, 2021. And the reason I push my children to educate personally is that my father always thought he was a very dumb person because he didn't have the qualifications, the paper qualifications, but he was an engineer in the war. He ran the mechanics and the barges at Rabaul. He transported a lot of Australian soldiers off Rabaul and Madang. He was a hero in my eyes. And when he came back to Australia, he was treated appallingly and called that black so-and-so yet again. And you're a lazy black so-and-so. And the appalling treatment by our wider society has to be questioned around the racism that exists even today. And that's why we need the books to start at an early age in the first 5 years and build this repertoire of storytelling and embed it into our society so we get a more intelligent, caring society that will never tolerate racism and sexism and all the isms, which really don't do anything for our society.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. So, and I think that is a really fantastic rationale for the need for all children in this country to have access to that rich storytelling tradition and that rich imaginative literature as well. It's my pleasure now to introduce Kelly Booker. Kelly has been a deputy principal and executive teacher and also a literacy advisor at the University of Canberra. She's now principal of Southern Cross Early Childhood School. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to start with a question that focuses very much on your role as the principal and the leadership role that you play with your team. How do you and your team use rich literature to meet the needs of all the learners in your school?
So as principal at Southern Cross, as Robin mentioned, we make it a priority to provide rich literature in all classrooms across the entire school. We make sure that there's a wide variety of literature, so fiction, non-fiction, and we often have conversations and discussions about, can the children in my classroom see themselves in the books that they are reading every day? We also prioritise rich literature to send home for children to read as part of the learning to read process, and also part of the process around, once we have great readers, trying to continue to keep them motivated, keep them wanting more. What are they getting from these stories that inspire them in their real world conversations and in their writing that they do here at school? We often have many meetings with our teachers here where we plan for intentional teaching with the rich literature for read alouds, for conferencing one-on-one with children, for modelling writing. And as part of that, we share rich literature across the school with one another, because if they have a bank of wonderful books to draw from their teaching, then they're going to use such a wide variety every day in their classrooms. I think that we talk a lot here about reading is thinking, and we can intentionally teach children patterns, sounds, symbols of the English language through this rich literature that's models for exemplary writing and just sparks such joy and wonder and curiosity for the children. So when we plan for these rich read alouds with children, we often talk about having all the children in the learning. So it's about teachers really reflecting on the questions that they're asking each of the children. It's about the connections that they're making. It's the sense of urgency to read more books, more stories, engage those children who we know may not present to school with such rich literacy experiences that some other children won't. So we talk a lot about, that sense of urgency. Let's make sure all children have books, great stories in all of their hands every single day. So I think one of the things here at Southern Cross is that we know that literature can connect each and every one of us to the big concepts that's happening in the world. And something that my kindergarten team had recently experienced with their children is just from reading this beautiful book, Museum of Me. They drew in lines of history and geography, and they really were curious, and they inquired into their own families and talked about what made them them. And so after a whole term of play, inquiring, wondering, asking questions with family members, each child had a museum of me that they had created that reflected all of the special things that were important to them. And at that point, they were able to share these beautiful museums with their family members, with all the people here at our school. And they invited us all in for a museum opening. And all of that rich learning across the whole term was sparked from one rich text that the children read with their teacher. So it's simply so amazing, the power of literature, the power of story, and where it can take our children.
Thank you, Kelly. I think that's a wonderful way to conclude, really. You've talked about the joy of literature. You've talked about its power. And it's also great that we've heard an emphasis from Jo about the years before school and now the exciting things that happen at school for all learners as well.
Can I just add, Robin? Kelly just I'm going to steal her line if I can, when she said reading is thinking. I think that's a great way to think about it. And I'm thinking back to Sam in my earlier points, that's great for the reader and the learner, but it's great from the point of view of the teacher. If that's what's guiding your choice of texts, we can only choose amazing texts that students can connect to or think critically about and so on. So I like that. Reading is thinking.
And Kelly, the theme, I guess, for the whole symposium has been, we all love a good story. Are there any concluding things you'd like to say around that theme?
I would love to. Thank you, Robin. So I think a personal connection for me, when I was in year 2, I borrowed the same book from the library for the entire year. And when I brought that book home every week, I would ask for my father to read that to me. And I just have such beautiful memories of snuggling up beside of him, reading this book, where he eventually got to know word by word, because he read it every night to me. But I think the most important thing is that relationship that I formed with my father through that experience. And I'm a true believer, and I continually talk with teachers here about, you know, reading has so many great things to offer.
Yes.
And one of the great things is that reading with somebody is forming that special connection and that relationship with them. There is so much power in that. And so often, if we have some children who need a moment, they need some help regulating, co-regulation, we will sit with them and we will share a story together to support that relationship and to develop it further. So I really think, you know, my 2 things, reading is thinking, it's also relational.
Well, thank you, Kelly. I think that's a great way for us to conclude our first session in our symposium. I guess we're all hoping that we stay lifelong readers and that we continue to think deeply and take a real critical inquiry approach to our life, and that stories, rich literature, are a fabulous way to do it. I'd like to thank Bronwyn, Jo, and Kelly for the wonderful things they've said today. And I'd like to encourage everyone to make sure that they tune in for the next 11 sessions in our Literature Symposium.